All right, we're going to start this particular section of the what I'm calling the four major socio-economic models. And I'm calling them the four socio-economic isms because they all end with a ism here. So I've got the two extremes out here we're going to talk about, and then there's two intermediary positions. This one brings up a word which we've talked about before, capital. And we said there's a four-letter word synonym for capital. Can anybody just remember it right offhand? The four-letter word for capital is synonymous with tool. Very good. Tool. So a highly capitalized society is a society that has a lot of tools. And we're talking about an ism here. You think, when you talk about ism, think about an organism. An organism is some kind of entity which has a lot of pieces, parts to it, but they're all intimately connected and they all work in harmony and they're all internally consistent with one another. So consistent that if any portion of that organism is in pain, the whole thing's in pain, because it's kind of like one being. So when we're saying about capitalism and communism, we're talking about a complex group of ideas that all work in harmony with each other. They're all linked together. They have an internal consistency to them. Now, capitalism is the idea that you can use your tools in whatever productive capacity you like. Capital's tools, capitalism is, yeah, you've got a right of private property. The tool is yours. If you want to use it for this direction, fine. If you want to use it in that direction, fine. And this private property, as our friend Adam Smith extolled the use of it, meant that, yes, private property has both a benefit and an obligation. In other words, for you or us to have the right of private property, that also means there's an obligation on somebody else not to mess with our stuff. Turning that around, there's an obligation on us not to mess with other people's stuff. That's part of both the benefit and the duty side of private property. So Adam Smith was extolling the idea of maximum private property rights give rise to a very high level standard of living. So if we're going to say what is the strongest argument for a capitalist society, it would be, it delivers, I'll just put this sign here, a high, that's an arrow up, standard of living. The strongest economic argument in favor of a capitalist or a capitalism sort of economic order is that it delivers a high standard of living. People who live in those societies tend to have a higher standard of living on the average than those who are not. But what would be the strongest argument against capitalism? Capitalism is not fair. Capitalism is not fair. Some people are born with a silver spoon in their mouth. Some people are born to very wealthy families. Some people are born with more intellectual horsepower than others. Some are born with better physique than others. Some people are born with athletic talent that other people don't have. And in a capitalist society, some people can become very, very wealthy. Very wealthy. And in a capitalist society, some people can be very, very poor. And if we hold to this concept of private property, and of people trying to maximize their own wealth. It's illustrated by Adam Smith, and we could bring that tradition even closer with people like Ayn Rand, where greed is a virtue, as long as you're not trampling on the private property rights of your neighbor. You could come away with a feeling like, yeah, that's a pretty cold, steely-eyed, uncompassionate view of your neighbor. Because if your neighbor has a child and that child needs some medical attention that's kind of expensive, and you have the capacity to help that child or that family, in a capitalist system, it is completely okay, from a legal standpoint, say, them's the breaks. I hope you get over it. There is no obligation for you to help that needy neighbor. Now, from a personal standpoint, from a personal perspective, I'm saying, yeah, I can argue there's a moral case that you as a human being should have mercy and compassion and all that sort of stuff. But I'm saying, as a system, is there going to be anybody that's going to say, hey, look, buck up. I mean, you got lucky, they're not so lucky. Lucky ones are supposed to help the unlucky ones. And you say, yeah, I don't think so. Besides, it's my money, and I can do whatever I want with it. Now, if I want to be charitable, I can. But if I don't want to be charitable, I don't want to be charitable. I'm just not going to be charitable. And in a free market, capitalist society, the buck stops right there. There's nobody that's going to force you to be good or kind or merciful. It's just not there. And that sounds like a very harsh view of an economic system, and I'd say to some extent that it is. Now let me back up with that and say, yeah, there could be some people out there that probably for no cause of their own live in desperate, poor conditions. Is there any obligation in a capitalist society for one person to help the other person? Well, I'm saying, yeah, there might be a moral obligation, but they can be their greedy old selves to the maximum extent in a capitalist society. Because it's mine. It's not yours. It's mine. Now, if I want to give you something, I can, but if I don't want to, I don't want to. And some would say, well, wow, this system allows some people to become not just rich, but filthy rich. At the same time, other people are really, really poor. And that just doesn't seem right. That just doesn't seem fair. But that's one of the outcomes of a capitalist system. Now, this private property thing. Adam Smith did not argue for the sanctity of private property. He just assumed it. He assumed it because the culture that he grew up in, Western civilization, assumed it. Where did that culture get it from? Well, they got it back, as we were talking about before, they got it back from the cultural norms that they had inherited. And there's one specific one, I'll call it the 8th, as in 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. Now, think about this for a second. Does it make any sense? Well, I'll use a thought experiment. Let's say that everything in this room belongs to all of us. It belongs to all of us. If it belongs to all of us, is it possible for me to steal this iPhone? Is it an iPhone? Yeah. Is it possible for me to steal it if everything in this room belongs to all of us? No. Because if there's no such thing as private property, right? It belongs to us. I'm an us, and so I got as much right to this thing as she does. That's in theory. In theory, I'm not taking your cell phone. I'm just making an illustration there. Now, coming out of this time period, after the Industrial Revolution, and a lot of wealth was being generated by those who could harness this new technology first. And there began to be classes of different sorts of people, not by tribes, but by occupation. And the people who tended to acquire the wealth to own the tools were called the capitalists. And the people that they hired to use their tools or come work in their factory or be the operator of their backhoe tended to be the laborers, the workers. And the wealth tended to accumulate toward the capitalist, and the laborers were paid just enough to keep them alive. And this world was divided up between the capitalists who owned the tools and the workers who worked for the capitalist. Now, this was a view of an economic system that was popularized by a guy named Karl with a K, and Marx with an X. Karl Marx wakes up one day. There's the world, my image of the world. And he says, wow, you know, there are some people, some privileged people out there who own the vast majority of all the wealth. But there's just a teeming mass of people who own just a tiny little sliver, just a very small slice of the economic pie, what we would call the few haves and the have-nots. And you know, it seems like the rich continue to get richer and the poor continue to get poorer. And how did it ever come about that these few people who own all the tools, the capitalists, how did they get this disproportionate amount of wealth when everybody else, the 90 percenters out there, 99 percenters, only have enough wealth to keep them alive from one day to the next? How did this maldistribution of wealth ever come about? Now, the classical economists, as your text refers to them, all believed in something called the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value. The labor theory of value says, how do things have value? How does that come about? Let's just talk about some vegetables or some lettuce or some cabbage or carrots or string beans or a cow or something like that. How does that get wealth? Become wealthy? Become wealth? And the labor theory of value says that, well, somebody had to go out there and chop down the trees and clear the land and till it and then put some seeds in there and weed it and probably put a fence around it so the animals don't eat it up. And then they got to keep the weeds out and care for it and all protect it. And then they got to harvest it. And after they harvest it, they can take it to the town and they can sell it and they can get a lot of money for that. But where did that wealth come from? It came from the labor of the person that produced the goods. So if it took a lot of labor to produce a good, then it had a high value. But if it didn't take much labor, then it was a low value. And Karl Marx and others, Adam Smith, believed in the labor theory of value. They all did at that point in time. And they go, oh, wait. All this stuff out there, It's got value because the worker, through their blood, sweat, and tears, created it with all their effort, and therefore the value of all that stuff was really produced by all these workers. But somehow or other, all the value that they produced wound up in the hands of the privileged few. How could that be? How is it that the privileged few wound up with all the labor, or all the value from the labor of the workers? Karl Marx called it the bourgeois and the proletariat, the bourgeois wealthy and the proletariat worker, and he broke down the economy and social economics into those two groups and how those two groups were in competition with one another. And he said, you know what? Do you know what caused this maldistribution of labor? It's this thing over here. It's capitalism. Because capitalism allows the capitalist to exploit and take away, you might call it stealing, take away the value that's produced by the worker. Now, we're going to pick up with this point here of this labor theory of value and critique it in a second and apply it to the pros and cons of capitalism and our two other forms of isms in there when we pick up in our next session.